Welcome back to Roundtable. I'm Bob Orr of the Press Club of Southwest Florida. And today we're looking at the topic of podcasting, one of the fastest growing sectors of media. Edison Research, a top firm, estimates that more than 140 million Americans at one time or another have listened to a podcast. Still, a lot of us don't know much about podcasting. We don't know how podcasts fit into the media landscape, how you might start one, how you build an audience, and so on. I'm going to try to get some answers to those questions and more today. Joining me to help lead the discussion will be Mark Young. Hey, Mark.
Hey there. Hi, Bob. Hi, folks.
My old pal Larry Doyle is with us again. Larry, hello. And also Jill Jaffe, who organized today's panel. She arranged for our guests. So Jill, why don't you get us started? And please, if you would, introduce our guests today.
Thanks, Bob. And hello, everyone, and welcome. And as Bob said, the podcast industry is really growing quickly. The number of podcasts is increasing every day, and powerful media outlets such as the New York Times and also celebrities and public figures, including Bruce Springsteen and former President Obama, are jumping into the fray. Today, we're fortunate to have several podcast producers and hosts from Florida share their success stories with us. Again, as Bob said, I just want to reiterate, we would ask everyone in the audience to hold your questions or comments until after all three clips have aired. So I want to introduce the three panelists now. First, I want to introduce Delia D'Ambra-Wheeler. Welcome, Delia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're glad you're here. Let me tell you a little bit about Delia. She's the co-creative director and on-air host for Audio Chuck Podcast Network, a media company that produces some of the world's true crime podcasts, including, among others, Counterclock and Crime Junkie. She's an investigative journalist, having worked most recently at NBC2 News, and is a Press Club board member. This clip, which we're about to share with you, in which Delia reports on an unsolved murder, is an episode from Counterclock. Let's take a listen.
This was violent, it was brutal, it was a terrible thing that occurred.
This is the first murder in Manio in more than a decade.
Someone fatally stabbed Stacey Stanton inside her apartment on February 3rd.
The only way to understand Stacey Stanton's story is to move counterclockwise in time, to go backwards to the point her clock violently stopped.
The night of the attack, friends saw Stanton leave the Green Dolphin pub.
That crime scene, whoever was there, they were covered in blood.
He's a monster. Whoever he is, he's got to be a monster. To do what he did to her was just...
They wanted a suspect. You know what I mean? They wanted a suspect fast.
Next, please join me in welcoming Andrew McDevitt, who co-hosts Talkin' the 239, which, as the name suggests, really focuses on local sports stars and what makes them successful. He has been producing digital sports content for over a decade, and previously was a reporter with the ABC TV affiliate in Fort Myers. The clip you're about to hear is from his interview with Brooks Sweat, an Olympian and FGCU beach volleyball legend. And although the 2020 Summer Olympics had to be postponed due to COVID, you'll hear that Brooke will be ready to compete in the games in Tokyo this summer. Bob, please roll the clip.
So, being an Olympian isn't something like I dreamed of. Never thought I'd be playing beach volleyball. I hated it, never played it growing up whatsoever. So to be in this position is kind of funny for me. But, the first time around in Rio didn't go our way whatsoever. So I'm looking to have a second chance and to make the best of it. And, what an opportunity I have in front of me, playing with the best ever. And Carrie, and learning from her on the way. And, we hope it happens next year. And if it does, we'll be completely ready to go.
So if you didn't grow up playing volleyball, what were you playing? And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure you did grow up right in Fort Myers in Southwest Florida.
Yeah, I sure did. I was born and raised right there in Fort Myers. Grew up there, went to school there, went to college there. But I played volleyball. I played a lot of indoor volleyball, but not beach volleyball. Going through school, volleyball, basketball, a little bit of softball, but never beach volleyball.
Finally, let's welcome Tonya Denmark and Christina Sawyer, who are co-producers and hosts of Florida Travel Pod. Hi, Tonya and Christina.
Hello.
Theirs is a podcast covering fun things to do in the Sunshine State. And really from beaches to small towns, golf, fishing, nature, cultural arts, whatever you're interested in, they provide insight to visitors about what makes Florida a premier tourist destination. They're seasoned travelers and also host a travel website. What you're about to hear is an episode describing a couple of tourist attractions in St. Petersburg, only a few hours drive from here. So let's go there now with Tonya and Christina.
Welcome to the Florida Travel Podcast, episode 7 about St. Pete, Florida. The Florida Travel Podcast is a podcast to help Florida residents and visitors get more out of the Sunshine State. I'm Tonya.
And I'm Christina.
We're going to talk about St. Petersburg, Florida.
I love St. Petersburg.
I do too. And we really think this should be on your must-do list. If you've never been to St. Pete before, there's a couple of different things we want to share with you. And it's really 2 different areas. So you have the beach, which is St. Pete Beach, but that can also include Treasure Island, Madeira beaches, other beaches. I think, Christina, you'll probably know a lot about the beaches area.
I do.
And then you have the downtown area. And so we're going to cover both of those today. But let's go back to the beach. I'm telling you, this is one of my favorite beaches to 100%. Go to.
100%. It is definitely one of my favorite beaches in Florida.
Okay, thanks everyone. These are great podcasts, and thank you for sharing your stories with us. They certainly represent a good cross section of genres, and I'm sure we're all wondering how did you decide to start a podcast, or what was the impetus for you to branch out into podcasting? Delia, you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. So like you had said, I came from a background of TV news reporting, and which involved a lot of crime reporting. And so when I decided I want to start a podcast, I want to cover an unsolved homicide, a case that's old that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I just sort of threw all my resources at knowing how to cover crime, knowing how to research, knowing how to investigate into that. And I think podcasting really gave me the format to be able to put a lot of time into the final product. Whereas in TV news, you're very limited by time, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. So I felt like I was able to really do the story justice by giving it more time, and podcast is sort of an unlimited amount of space that you can go. So that's really why I got into it and how I got into it. I think I just had some journalistic tools at my disposal, and that's what led me to it.
How about Andrew? You want to tell us how you got into podcasting, because I think you have a broadcast background as well.
Sure. Just like Delia, very similar. Was local here, reporting as a sports reporter for Waterman Broadcasting. Kicked around the idea of potentially running a podcast through them, but ultimately when I left, I wanted to stay involved in the local sports media scene and began the podcast. Like Delia said, with the skills that we had as journalists, it was more or less a natural transition with interviewing, the connections that I had in the sports community. So it's really allowed me to stay involved in sports media. Like she said, be creative and tell longer form stories, which is something that, like she said, I'm really repeating most of what Delia said, but when you have a minute and a half, there's not as much you can get through. When you can sit down with someone and speak with them for 40 minutes, you can really get the fine details of their story and just share more.
And I want to give equal time to Tonya and Christina. Thank you, Andrew. And I know it seemed like a natural evolution because you have a travel website. And in fact, you arrange tours for various clients. So could you tell us how did you take the leap into podcasting?
Well, like you said, it's I have a travel podcast and I've been writing it for over 5.5 years. And I love listening to podcasts. And I have a degree in broadcasting. So even though I never actually used it, I say, well, now 20 years later, I'm actually using my broadcasting degree. But I saw a void in the podcasts in Florida. I would listen to travel podcasts and they would be so all encompassing. that it was hard to be interested in every area that they were talking about, or if they were Florida based, they were Disney based. And we know that there is so much more to Florida than just Disney and just the beaches. So I reached out to my best friend, and I like the back and forth in podcasts. I like having someone to talk to. So I asked Christina to do this with me.
You know, I'm just curious, like if somebody wanted to start a podcast, what would you tell them? What do you need to do to launch a podcast?
Would you like me to take that one? For us, I was very lucky that I had a producer friend that I had guested on his podcast a couple of times, and he had all of the equipment. So I didn't really need, there was not a lot of barrier to entry on my end. However, you really don't need a whole lot to get started. You need a podcast hosting plan, a couple of decent mics, and maybe some software to mix it all together, which most of your computers come with.
Delia or Andrew, we'd love to hear, you know, your take on that as well.
Yeah, sure. Similar to what Tonya was saying, for me, the biggest confusing part as a first-time podcaster was the podcast medium and which one to choose. I just thought I'm going to upload it straight to Apple Podcasts or straight to Spotify. And obviously, as someone new and naive, that was not exactly the way you have to go. There are a handful of different podcasting mediums to use, but for me, that was the biggest barrier to entry, was finding one that worked well for me and was going to be efficient every time.
How did you choose one over others?
I actually went through 3 of them before I settled on the one that I went with. Just kind of trial and error, things not working the way that you wanted to. In some cases, maybe just not being smart enough to figure out how to update it. Unfortunately, I wasn't as lucky as Tonya was with someone who had been producing these. I had another regular Joe Schmo guy, and we were like, uh-oh, I have no clue what to do. Just trial and error.
And Delia, I know you are a producer, so can you tell us about, you know, tell us about it?
Yeah, so one of the things that for me, because I was initially putting out my podcast, at least the show Counterclock, was when I was working full time. So my thing was just time management and realizing that, you know, a good portion of my time was spent on the investigation piece, the writing piece, the producing piece. But the bigger challenge I identified right off the bat was the post-production editing. So my show involves a lot of sound design, a lot of interviews. I mean, if you think of like a traditional, you know, Dateline TV episode, that's exactly what I'm doing in the audio space. So there's a lot of elements that go into that post-production. So my biggest thing was finding an editing company that I would outsource my scripts. I would voice the scripts, write the scripts, but I would deliver all the assets to them. They would put it together, and then I would check it after that process was done. So that was something that I'm really glad I identified early on that I did not want to shoulder. So with the types of shows that I do, I think that was a really critical component, and is a really critical component to having a good sounding quality product. As far as getting it out there on the directories, to Andrew's point, you know, sometimes it's just trial and error, like, oh, wait, no, it's not linking to the right place. And, you know, you just kind of learn as you go. But once you have it, it's a very, very cool place, because Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much anywhere online can host a podcast. You know, the ability for someone to stream it in some way. And I think that's what's really cool about it. And probably, you know, I can't speak for everyone else, but it's what drew me to it, because I knew that the audience would be really big. So yeah, that's my answer.
So your genre of true crime is like one of the most popular genres. And I wonder if you want to maybe address a little bit of what you did in Counterclock. I think it was maybe in part of your clip that didn't air, especially the one about the cold case in the Outer Banks.
Yeah, so with the way my show is formatted, it's really me for a year investigating a cold case homicide. And so the first season of Counterclock was in my hometown in North Carolina, where I utilized my connections to that community to reinvestigate a murder from the 1990s. And within just a couple of months, that show got very successful before I then started working for Audio Chuck Network, who I work for now. And yeah, I mean, the true crime genre is huge. I think I'm almost positive that in like the top 5, worldwide or in specific like North America, there's usually always one, if not 2, true crime genre podcasts always in like the top 5 spots. And so that just shows you how much people listen to that genre. And I think it kind of, is reflective of news, what I came from, right? So people tend to pay a lot of attention and are very interested in the crime stories, leading the newscast. And so I think that same sentiment kind of carries through with the podcasting world for some reason. And so, yeah, I mean, the work that I'm doing with the shows is very investigative in that I'm actually looking and trying to get new leads in these homicide cases. And in the seasons that I've done, we have been able to have cases reopened, evidence be retested, law enforcement agencies held accountable. So it's really progressive in that way. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
I was going to ask you, how do you measure results? But I think you've given us a good example. Definitely. Also, Andrew, I'm interested in of course, everybody loves sports. You've interviewed some of the top athletes in this area and coaches. Tell us about your podcast. How do you find these subjects?
So as I mentioned in my intro, just being in the local sports reporting scene for 3.5 years before I left Waterman, I had tons of connections and just knowing when things would work. Our most recent episode featured an interview with Sammy Watkins, who actually went to the school that I teach at now, South Fort Myers High School. But the reason why it was cool for us and great time-wise was because he had just signed a free agent contract Ravens. So we were actually able to speak with Sammy Watkins before he had his introductory press conference with the Baltimore Ravens. So there were people from Baltimore reaching out, hey, can we use this in our article? Hey, can we write about this here? Sure, yeah, that's all great stuff. So for me, it's just, like Delia said, kind of playing off what I learned in my time in local news and knowing when things would work. For instance, another thing that I had sent over to you was when Fort Myers High School's head coach was named to the Hall of Fame. That was another no-brainer right that week. Hey, coach, any chance you could give us 30 minutes on a phone interview? And most of the time with my previous history with them, they are more than willing to share their stories.
Great. And Tonya and Christina, it sounds like you've been travel buffs from day one. How do you select the subjects or the things that you cover in your podcast, things that you love yourself and you think your viewers might enjoy?
We have a vast range of places that we have traveled, both of us, all over the place. So everything that you hear on our podcast, one of us has been there in some way, shape, or form. Narrowing down the topics is a process all on its own. We cover cities, but we also cover topics and we cover activities and, maybe something.
Yeah, like for example, we just finished scripting 2 episodes that we're going to record this week. And one is in Ocala, Florida, where I have been, and then she just got back from. And then another is like that broad range topic. We're going to talk about summer camps and things like campcations where you can either send your kids to camp or, travel to a destination in Florida and camp. So we try to do a mix of, those destinations, but also just sometimes general things to do.
Planning and like we have a road trip series that we are going to be releasing several, which is all different road trips you can take around Florida. So it's places you can stop along the road trips, but narrowing down these topics can be challenging considering how much we've traveled and that I've lived here almost my whole life and she's lived here all her adult life. So we've been here for a really long time. And so appreciating our state is really the thing that we're trying to get people to do, is look at the state as something to appreciate more than just, oh, it's got beaches. Yes, it has beaches, but it has so much more than that. So we've tried to think of the things that we've experienced over our life here and pick those topics and then expound on them as much as we can, getting people to listen and pay attention to something other than what you normally think of when you think of Florida.
So some of your podcasts are sort of family-oriented travel as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of family. We have a lot of it's for adults, kids, families. You can find pretty much, you can apply all of those things to pretty much any one of our topics.
Agreed. We both have families, so obviously we travel with our families, but we also know that we're looking for things that are just for us. For example, we were invited to explore a hometown recently on a mystery picnic, and that was an adult double date that we both took with our husbands. And so it's more than just family travel. It's more than couple travel. It's more than theme parks. It's more than beaches.
It's how to think outside the box in traveling.
And you kind of have fun.
We always have fun. We also try to encompass more than just hotel stays or more than just
attractions.
It's like I do a lot of camping. We do Airbnb things. We do hotel things. We do all kinds of
things.
Nature, yeah.
Kind of gives you the travel bug.
Right.
A little bit, because absolutely planning. I called her up the other day and I said, okay, we need to go on a trip before we do our next episode. So where can we go? That's a day trip. And we planned a day trip to Ybor City in Tampa because I was just itching to go somewhere at some point. So
we also can make travel out of a day trip, as opposed to it has to be a weekend or it has to be a week stay. We can travel without even making it a traveling trip.
If we don't inspire anybody else, we inspire ourselves.
Yeah. We'll talk about travel for you.
That kind of brings up another topic. I know some of you have been doing podcasts longer than others, but how do you, once you attract listeners, how do you build your listener base? And that's open to whoever wants to address it.
I'm going with content.
Yeah, we try to make sure that we're consistent. I think that's one key element into attracting our listener base, is that we produce and record several episodes at a time, but we release them once a week. So on Tuesdays, you're going to find the latest episode of the Florida Travel Pod. Other ways are social media, and getting out there in the community and just talking to people.
We see what other people want to hear.
Yeah, I'll say with listeners of true crime, so I do mostly series. So mine are not week to week. Crime Junkie, our main flagship show for Audio Chuck, is a week to week show. And to their point, having that content, knowing that you have a backlog of stuff that you're ready to release and you're not, slamming at the last minute. But for when you get a lot of listeners and a lot of people engaging on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and things like that, I think a big part is giving them ways to engage with your content. So I'll do call outs in a lot of my stuff for, hey, if you want to participate and you want to, help be involved in this case or, advocate for this victim or this family. I do a lot of that. And then we have a fan club for the Crime Junkie brand, which is Audio Chuck. And so we do like mailers, and we'll kind of engage, with fans. They can subscribe to our fan page and they'll get extra content. So in addition to the weekly episodes, they'll get an extra episode a month, or they'll get, an extra this or that, and stickers and merchandise and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ways to engage with people on that, and they just feel a part of your brand. And I just think it's something that in one way or the other, any sort of media is going to do. TV stations do, I don't know, events, and they give out stuff. So it's all part of that for us.
Yeah, piggybacking on all that, for us, it's definitely social media. When I'm able to interview an NFL talent, they have a much larger social media following than we do with Talking the 239. So when we are able to tag them in it and they're reposting that, then that's obviously bringing hundreds of thousands of more eyes potentially than we would have been able to garner on our own. So shout out to Sammy Watkins and all the people that we've had on that have shared that content and sent a whole lot more people our way.
Well, this is fascinating. I have another question. I think it might be on the minds of some of our press club members, many of whom are journalists, and that is podcasting slightly different from mainstream journalism, and in a couple of different ways. And I rather than suggest, I wonder if any of you would like to, especially those of you who have been in broadcasting, how is the model differently? For example, do you interface with the media per se, or how does it differ from broadcast, for example? you don't really have an editorial director. You're the editorial director.
Yeah, I mean, that's the, that's the kind of thing it depends on how you're presenting it. So with me, I'm doing a ton of fact checking. I have a producing team now where we, run everything through legal. We run everything through fact checking. I've got everything, sourced and cited, and a lot of the interviews are literally firsthand interviews. So it's not like I'm having to, cite a previous publication. I did it myself kind of thing. But that's kind of where I'm going, only again, because I'm in the true crime space. So, getting something wrong or, reporting inaccurately it's not good. So that's kind of where I come for the approach. It seems like with podcasts in general, though, it's just people that know how to tell a story or take a listener on a journey. And I think that's what Christina and Tonya are doing, and what Andrew does as well, is just being able to tell the story. So I'll kind of pass it off to them because I feel like they can speak certainly, about how they tell stories in their spaces.
Yeah, for us, we're having some technical difficulties on our side. That's why Christina keeps disappearing. For us, we want it to be casual. We want it to be like you sat down with a couple of friends and you talked about your favorite travel destinations, and we want to give you the advice of our firsthand experience. So yes, we do some fact checking. Obviously, we can't go and be everywhere, but you're good. But yeah, we want it to be very casual, very friendly, very approachable as well.
I would say from our end, it's almost completely different. Obviously, when you're doing interviews and stuff, we're speaking for facts, but Delia can probably attest, even when I was a journalist, I was certainly throwing my opinions in there, which is probably a little bit frowned upon, but it gives me more of an opportunity to do kind of what I fancy myself at doing best, and that is giving my opinion and giving polarizing takes and trying to spark some type of thought process in people. My original background was in sports talk radio. So anytime you're doing sports talk radio, you're just saying ridiculous things to seeing how many people you can get to call in. Podcasting, obviously not to the extent where sports talk radio is, but nonetheless, polarizing takes is what are really going to get people's attention. And in sports talk radio, and really, for my opinion, in television, I didn't want to be liked. I didn't want to be disliked. I wanted people to react to me, because if you're reacting to me, you're going to continue to come back and think, what is this guy talking about? What is he saying? And that means that more people are going to watch and listen.
Well, of course, in talking about travel, when you're pulling people in based off of a location, it's your opinion. You pick the location because you like the location. So when you're saying, oh, I think everybody needs to try this out, and people are like, yeah, I am not getting in a tube on a river where there's alligators swimming underneath my butt. So, I mean, you're offering them an opinion, but it's clearly placed that way. Like, we've clearly placed, look, this is places that we like. Look into it before you go, make sure. And I think that kind of clears us in that respect, that we are offering these as opinions, and it's very clear that way. But going with what Andrew said, I think that that's what entices people to listen, because they want to hear, well, what did you think about that place? That's the point. What did we think about it?
A lot of times people are not asking me, do I think this person committed this murder? Like, why don't we just look at what the facts say and look at all the facts that have never been found before? So that's kind of my approach. But one thing I will say is that, something that I do kind of at the end of each of my seasons is we'll do like a Q&A episode where it's me and an executive producer for the show, kind of talking about all the things that didn't quite make it in. And in a lot of those spaces, I'll offer, hey, this lead that I followed that kind of went nowhere, here's what I found out. And it's more of a discussion. And I think that that's not something that I would ever have gotten the chance to do in the TV broadcasting news space, because there really isn't. It's just the facts, which is good, just the facts, but there's really no ability to say, hey, but as a real human being, as a reporter in the field, here were some things that I gathered. Here's what my instincts were telling me. That's just not something that you get in that traditional broadcast space, but I am able to do that in this podcast form, which I think is good and authentic.
I think maybe the second part of that, how podcasting differs from traditional journalism is, I'm wondering, and I really don't know the answer to this. I'd love to have your opinions of this and how you do it. Are your podcasts always free? Is there a premium? Are they advertising supported? How does that work for each of you? Or how do you monetize your podcast, if you do?
will go ahead and start with that. Since I had been in the travel writing space, I have a lot of monetization efforts for my current website. So we've turned those into some of our sponsors. We do reach out for sponsorships, and you'll hear a sponsor at the top of every episode. That is one of the ways that we monetize. There was more to that question too.
Just that people offer us trips and stays and hosts and event things that we get to participate in.
Yeah, sometimes for us, our monetization efforts are things in exchange for coverage as well.
And affiliates.
Yes.
That would certainly be different than the traditional journalism model.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Andrew, excuse me, Delia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I would say my podcast is probably the youngest of this group and probably the least monetary. Oh, you're shaking your heads. All right, but not generated as much revenue, if you will. Pre-pandemic, we had a couple opportunities to do live podcasts at bars, which was a great experience for us, and a handful would then sponsor the podcast. But since then, it's kind of slowed down. But like they were saying, definitely advertisers that are sponsoring off the top. Delia's would be entirely different, especially because she's been kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, but she works for a massive podcasting company. So I'll toss it to her.
Yeah, I mean, really like the main thing. So when I first came out with my show in 2018, it was just me, self-funded, everything. When it got notoriety, really the analytics is what allowed it to be launched, to be monetized. So when you're looking at it like even traditional TV, if I can prove 100,000 people or 800,000 people are listening to this episode, I'm going to take that to an advertiser and they're going to pay money to be exposed to that audience. And so that's what I do with my shows. But what is really big in the podcasting space in terms of advertising is personal endorsement ads. And so a lot, if not all the ads you hear in my shows are me voicing them, saying, hey, I use this product, I use this brand, and here's how I used it, and here's a code that you can then use online to buy the product, to subscribe to the product, etc. And then to Christina and Tonya's point, there are some that you just say, hey, for 30 seconds at the top of the show, I'll read, shop at Home Depot if you need this, that, and the other. Sometimes it's voiced by people that that brand will just send the spot, and so there's different ways. But one thing that I think is really big for my show, and they can maybe speak to this as well, is if I do not like the product or brand, I will not put it on the show, because my work is reflective of my voice and my investigative work. So I'm not going to do any political ads. I'm not going to do any anything that is divisive or is not something that I personally want my face to be associated with. And I shouldn't say face anymore because I'm not on TV, but my
So I'm gonna jump in here because I want to make sure we get other people involved and other voices. This is all very interesting. Before I open it up to the floor, though, I know some of you have some questions. I want to go to Mark Young. He and I have had kind of a discussion on the side here about the whole business side of podcasting. Mark?
Oh, that's just it. I mean, you've taken a hobby and you've grown it into a business. How long does it take you to get from A to B? I know with my website, it took me roughly 3 years before I started to see any big return all of a sudden. How does that work with podcasting? I'll open it up to anybody.
For me, it took about a year to see an actual paycheck. But again, it really just depends, to Andrew's point, the timing of when you enter the space, what your product is, and how much it's consumed by an audience. So to that point, it really can fluctuate, but I think for me, it was about a year.
Yeah, for me, I'd be lying if I said that I'm out here making a whole lot of money. In fact, we probably haven't collected anything in a handful of months, probably 6 months. But pre-pandemic, the reason why I was able to get access to these bars was more or less because of the name that I'd already made for myself in the sports reporting community locally, people were like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. I remember the story he did here about whatever it was. And that was kind of the access point for me to get in and be able to familiarize myself with local investors in bars or whatever the case may be.
Christina and
We're in
Tonya,
the same boat.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
We're in the same boat. We actually, Andrew, we're only 4 months old. So when you talk pre-pandemic, I know you're older than we are podcast wise. So yeah, we have not turned a profit yet. Fortunately, like we said, the barrier was very inexpensive for us to enter. So it was reasonable and doable. And ours have been right now products in exchange for reviews and certain affiliate and sponsorships that we're working on, but it's not a full-time business yet.
That's my next question. You found a friend who had a full studio that you could use. I imagine Andrew and Delia had to build their own. What kind of a startup do you do? Do you buy the cheap stuff and then build as you go, or what?
So for me, I knew, obviously, was mildly familiar with the technology of it all, working in broadcast, but I just bought an audio mixing board, a Behringer audio mixing board. It has 6 different channels, so you could plug in 6 different mics if you wanted to. And then it was just a simple audio converter that would take it from the mixing board via USB into the computer. The program that I used to record is Audacity, which is free to literally anyone in the world, and it's super easy. Like, you could train a kindergartner to use Audacity. It's very, very simple. So outside of just those 2 simple purchases, I guess I had to buy microphones and XLR cables as well, but it was really only about $150, $200 total to get into it.
Yeah, for me, when I first started, I had 4 pillows in a fort on my bed, and I had 2 iPhones, one recording into the other, and I put it all on a Generation 1 MacBook Air that was 6 years old when I started it. So that, again, I knew I need an editing company. I'm gathering the assets, but I'm going to have someone else professionally put it together. That company that I used, and again, it's all about timing, they were a startup as well. So they charged me $100 per episode. That company now charges us, I don't want to give away too much, but they charge us a lot, thousands and thousands of dollars to edit our shows. So, I got in early and got stuff cheaper, but I think total investment for me on my end, like after year 1, was probably around the $5,000 mark. But then that's right about that time that I started to monetize and then merge with the network. So it's just, again, difference on timing, but that just goes to show you can make a podcast with 2 iPhones and a laptop, and people will listen to it.
So Larry and Mark and I all come from legacy media, and this newfangled stuff is a little confusing to us. I admire your courage, Larry. As you listen to this, spending 4 decades yourself with so-called mainstream media, what questions occur to you as to how these people are making career choices to move into the new frontier?
Well, my question really goes to control. Does anyone control the content of podcasts, or is it the ultimate freedom of speech? You can address any subject, no taboos, no words. How does that work? Is anyone in charge of regulating podcasting?
I would say that Apple Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify have access to remove stuff, but the only time that I've ever had any issues with that is copyright infringement. If you're using someone else's work, you can guarantee they're going to slap that and they're going to take it off their platform. But as for language use or taboo topics, as far as I know, the answer would be no. I know that my co-host occasionally gets a little animated with his work, might slip, something you wouldn't want to broadcast television, but hey, they've never had any issues with any language use on my end.
And for us, I know there's an option to check mark that if it includes anything explicit, it lets the reader or the listeners know ahead of time that there might be explicit language or content. Although we work to not do that on ours because we want it to be more accessible to everybody.
one thing I'll say with the true crime space is, again, we funnel all of our stuff through legal. So that's the same as any TV station. So there's regulation on our network's end. But even as a standalone person, again, the copyright stuff with what Andrew said, I cannot just rip file archive video from CBS News that covered the Oklahoma City bombing and put it in my podcast. That's going to be, I can only use a certain amount of seconds for that. So if I want to, you just got to be careful of that. But I think there is, like she said, the filters and stuff like that. But in terms of like traditional FCC, no. And I think the great thing about podcasting is if you don't like it, don't listen, and if it's opinionated, don't listen. And I think that's the kind of thing when you start to talk about talk radio as well. It's if you don't like it and you don't agree with it, don't listen. You can unsubscribe. You have to subscribe to a podcast to listen continuously and be updated on that show. So if you do not subscribe, you will not be exposed to it. So it's really that kind of engagement on the listener's end.
And to that note, I have to say too, as listeners are hearing you and things start, if you're putting out bad content, bad information, you're going to get caught anyway, and people aren't going to listen to you, and it'll be commented on, and it'll be, rated on your podcast player. People will rate you and say, this is a bunch of junk and don't listen. So, I mean, that stuff gets washed out with their dirty laundry too. So.
How often is your content self-generated? Or how often is it you do a podcast suggested by listeners?
We haven't, we've done a little bit suggested by listeners.
Mostly things we've heard or people have suggested for us to do, but
not as much yet, only because we're only 4 months in, but I would absolutely take people's suggestions and comments into consideration. We want that because like we said, we're out there exploring our backyards. We want to know about your backyards too.
So one thing, let me just jump in for a second. Delia, your podcast is a little bit different than what Christina and Tonya is doing, and a little bit different than what Andrew's doing. A lot of their stuff is very local with, interviews that are accessible and common experiences that Floridians might have. Yours is a little bit outside the box. Are any of you worried about the space getting too crowded? I mean, podcasting seems to be growing exponentially. You seem to be in fairly early. But if you think there was competition in the television market, for example, Andrew, I got to think the competition on the sports podcasting market is going to be huge. So how do you protect your niche and how do you grow your niche?
So for me personally, I would almost say that we got into it late. I would say that the podcasting boom probably happened in, 2017, 18, maybe. Niche is exactly the word. There are tons of sports podcasts, and I don't expect to compete with anything that ESPN puts out there. What I expect to compete with, and really I only know that there is one other locally that's talking strictly about sports in Southwest Florida, in Lee County, in Charlotte County, in Collier County. So for us, whereas Delia is chasing the hundreds of thousands of views, my goal is to chase the maybe thousands of views and really try and capture the local market here. And as far as I know, like I said, there's really only one other podcast that we would be competing with in the local sports scene.
What about you, Christina and Tonya? Because travel is a very popular topic, especially now post-COVID. Hopefully people will get back out and start traveling again. So how do you protect what you've developed so far?
Well, and I agree with Andrew. I think we're late into the game. I think podcasting has been around for several years. As long as there have been iPhones, there has been podcasts that have been out there. And I find when I'm looking for travel podcasts, I'm finding that there are a number that have also dropped off. You don't have the consistency that you may find a podcast that they stopped pushing episodes out in 2018. And that's where, for us, like, consistency is going to be key. Travel has to have changes and updates, and we have covered things that have closed through,
accidentally,
not on purpose, obviously, but we have to come back and say, hey, make sure you're checking us, make sure that you could be listening 3 years from now. Podcasts live out there forever until someone actually takes it down. So go and fact check us, but as long as we're out there still being consistent, I think that's how we can stay relevant.
So Delia, you're in a hyper competitive national type arena, a little bit different than what the other three folks here are doing.
Yeah.
So what's going to make you a winner in that environment? Is it production value? Is it the value or the content, the story? What is it that you're mostly focused on to protect your space?
Yeah, I mean, it's content driven. That's partially me as a journalist, right? I want to chase the story that is incredible. And so for me, it's the content's got to be good, the story, the interview, the quality of the sound, the quality of the interviews. That's huge for us. But I think really within the true crime space, I know for me personally and for Audio Chuck, we are very advocacy driven. So there are a ton of true crime podcasts out there, but a lot of them are sort of, let me just tell you this crazy story about serial killers while I'm, having a mixed drink. And then that's the end of the podcast episode. And there's nothing wrong with those formats. But I think what you lose and what we try and do is say, hey, here's a way that you can engage. If you identify as a victim of or survivor of domestic violence, if you identify with this story because of X, Y, and Z, here's a way that you can get involved. Here's how you can contribute to a nonprofit. So we're really kind of approaching the true crime space with, hey, get engaged with these stories. Let's try and make a difference. And I think that's what sets us apart from the pool. And I think, it all goes back to content and quality and what your ending message is.
So we've got about 10, 15 minutes left here. Thank you all for your time, and the insights are very interesting. Turns out we have another podcaster on the call. George Lehner was a podcaster. George, tell me just briefly about your experiences. What were some of the challenges you faced?
Well, I started doing podcasting in about 2015, and the podcast I did kind of followed the radio sports talk show that I used to do. And we do it live from bars and restaurants and have guests and take phone calls and all that. And we formed our own network, so to speak. And we had an underwriter, but had some pretty healthy pockets. And everything went very well for about 5 years. Even after I moved to Florida, I flew back to Columbus, Ohio, where it was based. And we continued to do the podcast once a week, and they paid for my travel and everything else. And it was nice. It was lucrative. But eventually the guy's pockets ran dry. And the problem we ran into is we didn't have anybody on the street selling the podcast. And I didn't feel like I was in a position where I wanted to donate my time and effort. I wanted to try and, get paid. And so eventually I did it. I did it from down here, no remote, no flying and all that. And I did it from down here in my home for a couple of years, and it was fine. Engineering wise, the people that did this thing really put a lot of money into the product. The product was something that you could really be proud of. The technical part of it was outstanding. The only problem was eventually nobody could figure out how to make any more money at it. There wasn't anybody out selling it. And that was the real frustrating part. And I really applaud Delia. I remember when Delia first started doing it, and to see how her product has grown and to see that she's hooked up with this network is fantastic. And I'm curious about the other two making money. And obviously, the question was answered. But to me, I'm to the point where anything I get into, I want to make some money. I don't want to get rich, all that. But I want to cover my time. And it just got really frustrating, the hours that you would spend lining up guests and working on your format and coming up with everything, and you don't see any money out of it. That was the frustrating thing. That's why my son and I even did a podcast a year or so ago. And again, he's working, and I'm an on-air talent. I'm not a salesperson. And eventually it just went away. So the money end of it was the frustrating end for me, Bob.
I can tell you, on-air people know nothing about sales.
No,
I
nor do we want to. We don't
guarantee
want
that's the case. Arnold Klinsky has a question. Eventually, I'm going to get back to Jill and our panelists, and we're going to wrap this up here in about 10 minutes. But I know, Arnold, you have a question. Go ahead.
I do, and they're both about monetizing. I love that word. Do the three organizations or the four people actually are also salespeople and go out and knock on doors and get paid advertisers? And the other question is, do you get return advertisers? They give you money, you put their message out, but they're disappointed. They say, we've got grand opening on Saturday and no one came to the grand opening. You have a lot of repeat advertisers because of the success of your reach and your message. So do you do the sales, and does it work for advertisers?
I'm kind of piggy. Go ahead, Delia.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I personally do not do the advertising. We have marketing people. At first, I was my marketing person. Now there's marketing people that's their job. That's why we hire them. But again, I go back to, they can bring ads to me all day, but I'm not going to put that on my product if I don't agree with it. And I don't endorse it and that sort of thing. So that's where I come at with it. And what was the second part of your question? The return advertisers? Do we get?
Yeah, the question is, okay, your marketing people who have to be paid too, right? So that makes you got a different issue. But no, people pay money or give something to get the message out on your podcast. And it's, I'll make one up, it's our grand opening of, or a special sale. No one shows up because the audience wasn't enough of an audience for the message. How much repeat advertising do you have because it worked for the advertising?
Yeah, so the way
all three of you.
Yeah, so the way it works for us is it's not so much that necessarily like, okay, your product's sold, you'll come back. We do almost, I would say, a large majority in the digital space. So if you use the promo code Counterclock at your purchase on Amazon or your purchase on whatever the website is, the retailer can measure the metric of that, and they can say 500,000 people used this code, which means the ad we bought for this show is paying off. And so they just continue to evolve the ad to include that. And so that's really, I would say, a big majority of the ad space in podcasting.
But in your case, it worked. I mean, the short answer to me was no. We reach people, they buy or do whatever they do, and so the advertiser stays with you because it worked. What about our other two podcast people?
I don't want to speak for Christina and Tonya, but I think, at least in my case, Delia is in a different stratosphere than what I'm working with. Kind of piggybacking on what saying, I'm an on-air guy. I'm not a sales guy, although I'd like to think I could really sell just about anything. But yes, sales has also fallen on my shoulders. Pre-pandemic, we were able to sell a couple shows and do some remote broadcasts. Once the pandemic hit, then obviously bars weren't open as much. I also, with the teacher gig, I head back to Philadelphia for the summer, spend time with my family. So that's sort of fallen off. But we have had some repeat advertisers that, like the certain bars that we went to pre-pandemic where we had successful broadcasts there, they were very interested and stayed on a couple of times.
Christina and I both have backgrounds in marketing. So right now we are doing all of our own work and reaching out to companies to either sponsor us or, I hate to say, give us free stuff, but bring us somewhere to experience their product or their location. And I had a lot of contacts prior to starting the podcast as far as being in the travel space that I've been able to reach out to and work with. So in essence, yes, we've had repeat, even though we're new. It's repeat. Basically, someone worked with me in the blog atmosphere and now work with me on the podcast side. But yeah, we do.
But they come back because whatever you promoted about them worked. I'm assuming you said go to this place. So. People went to this place, and they said, "Well, let's keep doing it." That's what I'm assuming. And
I hope so.
If it didn't, if they paid you money or gave you something that's of value, and then no one showed up, they might not come back. Right? Jill, I'm going to give you the last word because you led us down the path very nicely. Any last thoughts here?
Well, I just had one question. It seems like we've all talked about a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, but how do you see the future in podcasting?
I see a lot of networks. I see a lot of television networks outsourcing to podcasting. It's already occurring. Television programs as well. There's a reason that the New York Times and Dateline, ABC News, there's a reason that they have podcasts, and it's because they want to compete in this market because they're losing numbers in the television market. That's just the reality of it. So that's where I kind of see it going. As far as true crime will always be a consumed product in podcasting because it was birthed in podcasting in a lot of ways. So that's what I think will happen.
I would
Last word from Andrew, and then we'll get Christina and Tonya.
Sure. I would just say, like Delia said, I think it's going to continue to grow. With the background in sports talk radio, the way that I've seen sports talk radio slowly diminish over the years, you've seen podcasting continue to grow. And you look at what Spotify did with Joe Rogan, those numbers are like Howard Stern numbers in the form of dollars and cents that I don't think really anyone will ever see in talk radio ever again. I think that will go to the podcasting platforms, whether it's Spotify, whether it's someone else. But quickly, I want to shout out Delia. The week that Conor McGregor as a sports guy fought, Delia had higher numbers than Joe Rogan's podcast, which is just mind-boggling to think about.
Christina and Tonya, I guess you're going to get the last word here.
I agree. I think it's going to continue to grow. I think it's such a fun medium. It is content that we own, whereas, on your social media channels, you can go ahead and talk all you want, but you don't own that content. Facebook does, or Instagram does. We own our content. We can say what we want, within reason. And as long as we are engaging and having fun, sometimes it might be just for us, but other times it can be, we want to invite everyone along for the ride too.
And much like your content is, we're a niche content, something that's very direct
Specific.
and small is going to grow because people are looking specifically for those things. You're talking Google SEO and all of that, and you're talking about what are people searching for. They're not searching for Florida travel, they're searching for a city, they're searching for a topic in the state of Florida. So niche content like you guys have as well is gonna continue to grow.
Yeah, like our Siesta Key episode is our biggest download right now because people are looking for specific types of travel.
Well, this has been really interesting, and I mean that sincerely. I learned quite a bit myself. I hope others did as well. Thanks to Larry Doyle and Mark Young, as always, and a special thanks to Jill Jaffe, who really did a great job researching this and lining up the guests, and we truly appreciate her efforts. This taught us something, and that, after all, is part of the mission here on Roundtable. If
Bob,
you are viewing
we want to know how to
Roundtable,
find podcasts. No one knows how to find them.
Oh.
You can find any podcasts on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Amazon Music,
Google
Podcasts, Google Play.
If you search their name on Google, it'll show up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
if you're watching us on our Press Club YouTube channel, we thank you for that. Make sure you hit our subscribe button, tell your friends about it. We may get a podcast someday, but not quite yet. And then keep an eye out for the next roundtable. We will see you next time. Thanks again.